The rain in Charleston doesn't just fall, it visits. It sweeps in from the Atlantic, heavy and thick with the scent of pluff mud and salt, rattling the loose tin roofs of the historic district and slicking the cobblestones of Meeting Street until they shine like anthracite. Inside her third-floor apartment, Coretta Miller didn't mind the rain. To her, the rhythmic drumming against the window pane was the only predictable company she had left. Coretta was 68 years old today. She stood in her small, immaculate kitchen, her spine straight, a habit beaten into her by 35 years of standing behind the mahogany reference desk at the Central Bank's Research Library downtown. Her skin was the color of roasted coffee beans lined with the gentle silver-threaded typography of a life spent reading between the lines of other people's histories. Her silver hair was neatly pressed into a soft crown-like chignon at the nape of her neck. On the counter sat a freshly baked sweet potato pie. The crust was fluted perfectly by her fingers, a deep golden brown radiating a warmth that smelled of nutmeg, toasted brown sugar, and dark vanilla. In the Gullah Geechee traditions she had inherited from her grandmother on Edisto Island, you didn't let a milestone day pass without baking. A sweet potato pie wasn't just dessert. It was an anchor. It was the taste of survival of love that took time to cultivate. "Happy birthday to me," Coretta whispered, her voice a low melodious hum that carried the heavy rhythmic cadence of the Low Country. She set down the tin and looked at the small kitchen table. It was set for two white porcelain plates, 2 silver forks that had belonged to her late husband Leonard, and 2 ironed linen napkins. Leonard had been gone for 5 years now. The massive stroke had taken him on a Tuesday morning right while he was adjusting his tie for work. He had been a master carpenter, a man whose hands were rough from pine and oak, but whose heart was as soft as cotton. Together they had poured every single drop of their sweat, every saved dollar from her library salary and his carpentry workshop into one single vessel, their son Julian. Coretta walked into the living room, her steps silent on the worn Persian rug. The apartment was a living archive. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves stacked with leather-bound volumes of South Carolina history banking ledgers and economic textbooks. But the center of the room belonged to the photographs. There was Leonard grinning wide with sawdust in his beard, holding a 5-year-old Julian on his shoulders at Folly Beach. There was Julian at 18, dressed in a sharp navy suit, holding his acceptance letter to an Ivy League university. Coretta touched the glass of that frame. She remembered the nights her fingers had bled from taking on extra shifts, typing up legal transcriptions into the early hours of the morning, just to afford the tuition that scholarships didn't cover. She remembered Leonard selling his prized plot of land near the river, the land he had purchased to build their retirement cottage, just so Julian wouldn't have to carry the suffocating weight of student debt. "Our boy is going to sit in the high offices, Coretta," Leonard had told her, his eyes bright with tears that night. "He's going to build generational wealth. We are laying the bricks so he can build the mansion." Julian did build the mansion, literally. At 38, Julian Miller was the youngest branch manager of the flagship regional bank in Mount Pleasant, the wealthy oak-lined suburb across the Cooper River Bridge. He drove a pristine midnight black Mercedes-Benz. He lived in a custom-built 5-bedroom home with his wife Patricia, a woman whose skin was the color of cream and whose family owned a lucrative chain of luxury medical spas across the state. But somewhere along the highway of success, the bridge between Mount Pleasant and Coretta's small apartment on Meeting Street had stretched too far. Julian's visits had dwindled from weekly dinners to monthly obligations, then to 15-minute phone calls while he was stuck in traffic. Coretta checked the clock on the wall. 10:15 a.m. She took a deep breath, smoothing the apron over her house dress, and picked up her tablet from the coffee table. She bypassed the standard telephone app and dialed his direct office line. It rang 3 times before the crisp professional voice of his secretary answered. "Manager Miller's office, this is Clara." "Good morning, Clara. This is Coretta Miller, Julian's mother. Is he available?" "Oh, Mrs. Miller." Happy birthday, Julian mentioned it was your big day. Let me see if I can pull him out of his budget review. Just one moment. The hold music was a sterile, synthesized jazz that lacked any real soul. Coretta weighted her heart, performing that small, anxious flutter that only a mother understands, the gut instinct that warns you when the child you carried is slipping away from the truth. "Mom, hey!" Julian's voice cut through the line, loud-hurried, punctuated by the rustle of heavy bond paper and the click of a fountain pen. "Clara said you called." "Happy birthday, Mom. 68, right? You're catching up to the century mark." Coretta forced a soft chuckle, though the casual distance in his tone pinched her chest. "Not quite there yet, son, but close enough to appreciate the view. I was calling about tonight. The pie is out of the oven. I thought we could have that dinner we talked about. I'm making the low-country smothered chops just the way your father liked them." There was a pause, a heavy static-filled void on the line. Coretta knew that pause. It was the same hesitation Julian used to have when he was 12 years old and had broken her crystal vase but hadn't found the words to confess it yet. "Mom, look. Tonight is just impossible." Julian said, his tone shifting into the smooth, practiced register he used for disgruntled, high-net-worth clients. "The regional board just called an emergency compliance audit. I'm actually packing my briefcase right now. I have to catch the 2:15 p.m. flight out of Charleston International to New York. We're meeting with the federal regulators first thing tomorrow morning." The air in the room suddenly felt thin. "New York?" Coretta asked softly. "On a rainy Thursday." "It's the banking world, Mom. It doesn't stop for birthdays," Julian replied, a hint of defensive irritation clipping the edges of his words. "If I don't secure this compliance sign-off, my promotion to the regional vice presidency is dead in the water. You want this for me, right? We talked about this. The legacy." "Of course I want your success, Julian," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, steady rhythm. "Your father and I gave our lives for that success." "Great. I knew you'd understand. Look, I'll make it up to you. Next weekend I'll have Patricia order a cake from that French bakery she likes in Bell Hall, and we'll come by for a quick lunch. Sound good? I really have to run. Clara is holding the taxi line." "Have a safe flight, Julian," Coretta said. "Thanks, Mom. Love you. Bye." The line went dead. Coretta slowly lowered the tablet to her lap. The apartment returned to its heavy, rain-soaked silence. She looked at the 2 plates on the table. She looked at the sweet potato pie steam still rising faintly from its crust, filling the room with a sweetness that now felt incredibly bitter. For 3 hours, Coretta sat in Leonard's old leather armchair, watching the rain tap against the window. A weaker woman might have wept. A lonely woman might have wrapped herself in a blanket, eaten a sliver of pie alone, and gone to bed before the sun even set. But Coretta Miller was the daughter of a woman who had marched in Savannah for civil rights and the wife of a man who had built churches with his bare hands. She did not do despair. She did not do pity. At 4 p.m. she stood up. "No," she said aloud to the empty room. "I am 68 years old, and I am still here." She walked into her bedroom and opened the cedar wardrobe. Hanging in the center, protected by a linen garment bag, was her armor. It was a vintage structured sheath dress made of heavy royal blue silk with a matching tailored jacket. Leonard had saved for 3 months to buy it for her for their 30th anniversary. "When you wear this, Coretta," he had told her, "you look like royalty. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small in this world." She took her time dressing. She brushed her silver hair until it gleamed, securing it with amber pins. She applied a subtle line of dark eyeliner and a swipe of plum lipstick. Finally, she opened the small mahogany jewelry box on her dresser and pulled out 2 heavy, solid gold hoop earrings carved with intricate West African Adinkra symbols representing strength and endurance. Leonard had commissioned them from a local black goldsmith downtown. When she looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she didn't see a forgotten widow. She saw a matriarch, a woman of substance. She grabbed her vintage leather handbag, tucked her tablet safely inside, and walked down the stairs of her building. In the lobby, the elderly doorman Marcus, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, looked up from his desk. His eyes widened and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. "Well now," Marcus said, standing up straight and tipping his cap. "Miss Coretta, you look like a Sunday morning in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, heading somewhere grand." "It's my birthday, Marcus," Coretta said, her smile elegant and composed. "And I refuse to let the rain have the last word." "Happy birthday, ma'am. Is Mr. Julian pulling up in that fancy car of his to take you over the bridge?" Coretta's expression didn't waver by a millimeter. "No, Marcus. My son is attending to his investments. Could you call me a traditional taxi? I'm dining downtown tonight." "You got it, Miss Coretta. Only the best for you." 10 minutes later, Coretta was sitting in the back of a classic yellow cab, watching the historic district flash past the rain-streaked windows. The gas lanterns of Broad Street were flickering to life, casting amber pools on the wet asphalt. The city was beautiful, historical, and deeply divided by old money and new ambition. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. "The Charleston Waterfront Grill," Coretta replied. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyebrows lifting. The Waterfront Grill was one of the most exclusive establishments on the peninsula. It sat on a pier jutting out into the harbor, a place of white tablecloths, gas-fired fire pits, and a guest list that usually required a net worth with 6 zeros or a last name that dated back to the plantations. It was a place where a retired librarian of color didn't typically walk in alone on a Thursday night. But Coretta didn't care about their history. She had her own. When the cab pulled up to the grand columned entrance of the restaurant, the valet held a massive golf umbrella over her head as she stepped out. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasted oysters, and expensive perfume. She walked through the heavy oak doors. The interior was stunning, exposed historic brick floor-to-ceiling glass windows looking out over the churning gray water of the Ashley River and low, warm lighting. A grand piano was being played softly near the bar, the musician drifting through a smooth, melancholic rendition of Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World. The maitre d', a young, sharply dressed white man with a slicked-back undercut and a clipboard, looked up. His eyes scanned Coretta's royal blue dress, the solid gold hoops, and her solitary presence. His professional warmth cooled by just a fraction of a degree. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to the waterfront. Do we have a reservation under a party name?" "No reservation," Coretta said, her voice carrying that distinct, resonant authority she used to command the reference room of the central bank. "Just a table for one, please. Somewhere quiet near the water." The maitre d' tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Ah, I see. Well, on a Thursday night with the storm, we are actually fully committed for our indoor dining. I could perhaps find you a stool at the back bar." "Young man," Coretta interrupted gently, but with a weight that made him stop mid-sentence. She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Look at this room. There are at least 4 open tables along the north glass. My name is Coretta Miller. I spent 35 years ensuring that the executives of the bank that finances this very pier had the correct data to build their fortunes. I am celebrating my 68th year on this earth tonight, and I am not sitting on a bar stool near the kitchen doors." The maitre d' swallowed hard. The absolute lack of fear or anger in her face was far more intimidating than a customer throwing a tantrum. He checked his screen quickly. "My apologies, Mrs. Miller. Follow me, please." He led her through the crowded dining room. The scent of seared Wagyu beef and expensive champagne hung thick in the air. Wealthy patrons in tailored blazers and diamond tennis bracelets chatted amiably. As they neared the premier VIP section, a raised platform surrounded by lush velvet ropes with the absolute best unobstructed view of the river, Coretta's footsteps faltered. Her heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt as though it had been struck by an icy mallet. There at the center round table of the VIP section sat her son, Julian. He wasn't in a crisp navy suit waiting at a boarding gate at the airport. He wasn't in New York preparing for a federal audit. He was wearing a casual, expensive cashmere sweater, his face flushed pink from laughter and high-end bourbon. To his left sat his wife Patricia, looking radiant in a cream-colored designer dress, her diamond necklace catching the ambient light. To his right sat his mother-in-law, Edith, a towering, razor-sharp woman with meticulously dyed honey-blonde hair, heavy gold jewelry, and an aura of supreme arrogance that Coretta had detested since the day she met her. And next to Patricia sat Amanda Coretta's 14-year-old granddaughter, looking slightly detached, scrolling through her phone. In the center of their table was a beautiful multi-tiered white cake from the exact French bakery Julian had mentioned on the phone. Glowing brightly in the center were wax candles shaped into the numbers 45. It wasn't just a business dinner. It was a birthday party. A celebration for Patricia's 45th birthday. Coretta stood completely frozen in the aisle. The maitre d' noticed her, stop, and turned back confused. "Mrs. Miller, is everything all right?" Coretta didn't hear him. The music from the piano seemed to fade into a distorted underwater drone. The laughter from Julian's table pierced her ears like shards of broken glass. "He lied to me." Her mind repeated a fierce, burning heat rising from her stomach up into her throat. "He looked me in the eye. He knew it was my day, and he chose them. He chose her mother. He chose the lie." She watched as Julian lifted a crystal flute of vintage champagne, clinking it against Edith's glass. Edith laughed, her sharp, manicured hand dismissively waving in the air as she said something that made the whole table chuckle. Coretta remembered the wedding 15 years ago. Edith had taken over the entire planning, relegating Coretta to a back row seat, treating her like an inconvenient relic from Julian's impoverished past. Edith had once told a group of guests within Coretta's earshot that Julian was a remarkably driven young man considering where he started, and Julian had allowed it. He had swallowed his family's pride for a seat at Edith's table, and tonight he had sacrificed his own mother on the altar of his wife's vanity. "Mrs. Miller," the maitre d' asked again, his tone growing concerned as he saw the profound stillness in her posture. Coretta took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath. The initial shock of grief, the primal physical ache of a mother, realized she had been discarded by the child she gave her blood to raise, hardened into something else. It hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp clarity. She turned her head to the maitre d'. "Change of plans, young man," she said, her voice dropping an octave, completely calm, completely lethal. "I won't be needing that table in the corner after all. I've just found my party." Before the maitre d' could react, Coretta stepped out of the aisle and walked toward the raised VIP platform. Her low heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor with the steady, unyielding tempo of a drumbeat before a battle. Amanda was the first to look up from her phone. Her eyes went wide, her lips parting in utter shock. "Grandma?" she gasped. The entire table suddenly went quiet. Julian turned around his champagne glass halfway to his mouth. The moment his eyes landed on Coretta, standing there in her royal blue dress, her solid gold hoops catching the firelight, her face an unreadable mask of absolute dignity, the color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had seen a ghost. He choked slightly on his drink, setting the glass down so hard that champagne sloshed over the rim onto the white linen. "Mom," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, losing every ounce of his smooth executive confidence. He looked around the room frantically as if praying for a fire alarm to go off. What are you doing here?" Patricia turned pale, her hand instinctively flying to her diamond necklace. Edith, however, merely narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a tight, frosty sneer as she leaned back in her chair. "Coretta," Edith said, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive condescension. "What an unexpected surprise. I didn't know you frequented places like this." Coretta ignored Edith entirely. She didn't even grant the woman the charity of a glance. Her eyes remained locked onto her son, staring into the depths of his cowardice. "Hello, Julian," Coretta said, her voice smooth, deep, and perfectly audible to the surrounding tables. "I was just thinking about your flight to New York. The weather must have been truly terrible for your plane to be forced to land right here on Meeting Street." Julian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a little boy who had been caught with his hand in the jar, terrified, small, and utterly defenseless. "Mom, look," Julian whispered, his face turning a deep, shameful crimson as he leaned forward, trying to keep his voice low. "I can explain. It's not what it looks like. Patricia's mother surprised us with this reservation. It was a last-minute thing for her 45th. I was going to call you from the hotel tonight, I swear." "Julian," Coretta said, interrupting him with a gentle, terrifying softness. She looked at the beautiful white cake, then back at him. "You don't need to sweat through your cashmere, son. I understand perfectly. 45 is such a grand, monumental number, isn't it? It certainly commands much more respect than 68. "Grandma," Amanda said, her eyes filling with sudden tears as she stood up from her chair. "I didn't know. Dad told me you had gone to a church retreat for your weekend. I swear I didn't know it was your birthday today." Coretta's expression softened instantly as she looked at her granddaughter. She reached out and patted Amanda's cheek with a warm, trembling hand. "I know, baby. I know you didn't know. Your heart is pure, just like your grandfather's was. Sit back down, sweetheart. Eat your cake." "Allison," Edith chimed in, her voice sharp, inserting herself into the conversation like a blunt instrument. "Let's not make a public scene in front of Julian's clients over a simple family scheduling conflict. It's highly immature. We can discuss this at a more appropriate time." Coretta finally turned her eyes to Edith. The sheer, icy power in Coretta's gaze made the older blonde woman flinch back by an inch. "My name to you, Edith, is Mrs. Miller," Coretta said, her voice ringing like a bronze bell. "And I am not speaking to you. I am speaking to the boy I carried for 9 months and raised to be a man, though it appears I missed a few steps along the way." She turned back to Julian, who was trembling slightly, the veins in his neck bulging. "You told me the banking world doesn't stop for birthdays, Julian," Coretta said, pulling her tablet out of her leather handbag with a slow, deliberate movement. "And you were absolutely right. It doesn't." She unlocked the screen. The bright white light of the banking application illuminated her face. "Mom, what are you doing?" Julian asked, a sudden sharp note of panic piercing through his embarrassment. "Put the tablet away. Let's go outside and talk." "Oh, we are going to talk, Julian. But first I have a birthday gift to deliver," Coretta said. "To myself." She tapped the screen 3 times. Her fingers were completely steady. "You see, Julian," Coretta whispered, looking down at him with a mixture of profound sorrow and unyielding power. "You've spent the last 10 years believing that because you have the title of branch manager, you hold the keys to this family's kingdom. You forgot who laid the bricks." She slid the tablet across the white tablecloth right over the smeared champagne, stopping it directly in front of his plate. "Take a look, son," Coretta said softly. "Consider it the first lesson of your emergency audit." The digital ink on the tablet screen was crisp cold and glaringly bright against the dim amber romance of the waterfront grill. Julian stared down at the glass. His eyes, heavy from top-shelf bourbon just moments before, darted across the columns of data. His breathing hitched. On the screen was the master portal for the Miller family estate holdings. A complex web of revocable living trusts, high-yield municipal bonds, and primary liquidity accounts that his father Leonard had meticulously structured before his passing. At the bottom of the screen, a system notification flashed in crimson text. "Transfer confirmed. Authorization revoked. Access status locked." "Mom!" Julian's voice was barely a whisper, thin and reedy, completely stripped of his usual executive posture. "What did you do this? This is the main operational pool, the commercial paper portfolios. I have 3 clearing drafts scheduled for midnight." "I know exactly what it is," Julian, Coretta said. She stood over the table, her hands clasped lightly in front of her royal blue dress, as unmoving as the oak trees lining the Battery. I spent 35 years cataloging the financial anatomy of this city while you were still learning your fractions. Did you truly believe that because I retired to a quiet apartment, my mind went blank? Edith snapped her designer purse shut with a sharp metallic clack. She leaned over the table, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawn into a tight defensive line. Julian, what is she talking about? What money? You told us your mother's affairs were entirely under your signature. You said the earnest money for the Kiowa Island property was already cleared. Julian didn't answer his mother-in-law. Sweat was beginning to bead along his hairline, tracking down into his neat beard. He frantically tapped the tablet screen, trying to input his administrative password. Error. Invalid credentials. Contact primary trustee. It won't work, son, Coretta said, her voice dropping into that low, rhythmic, low-country cadence that felt as inevitable as the tide. Your father was a carpenter, Julian, but he understood the grain of human nature. When he drew up that trust, he made me the absolute, irrevocable primary holder. You were the manager, the steward. You had permission to invest, to grow, and to maintain the accounts, but you never owned them. You were playing with your father's wood, but the workshop still belongs to me. Patricia's face shifted from pale embarrassment to sheer panic. She grabbed Julian's arm, her manicured nails digging into his cashmere sleeve. Julian, answer her. The construction down payment for our custom build in Mount Pleasant drafts tomorrow morning. The architects, the contractors, if that escrow account is frozen, the lot holding goes back on the open market. It's not just frozen, Patricia, Coretta said calmly, turning her gaze to her daughter-in-law for the first time. It's gone. I have legally reallocated the liquidity into an independent non-joint maritime holding structure. As of 4 minutes ago, Julian's signature cannot buy so much as a box of nails in the state of South Carolina. Julian stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Several patrons at nearby tables turned to look. The polished elite veneer of the waterfront grill was cracking, exposing the raw, ugly sinew of a family war. Mom, please. Julian hissed, his hands shaking as he leaned across the table, trying desperately to lower the volume of the confrontation. You are overreacting. This is insane. You're doing this because of a dinner, because of a misunderstanding about a schedule. We can celebrate your birthday tomorrow. I'll rent out the private room at Hall's Chop House. Just unlock the clearing accounts. A misunderstanding. Coretta's voice didn't rise, but it grew denser, heavier, filling the space between them, until Julian felt compressed. You looked into my face over the digital wires this morning, Julian. You heard the loneliness in your mother's voice, and you manufactured a lie about federal regulators in New York just so you wouldn't have to look at my aging face over a sweet potato pie. You didn't hide me because you were busy. You hid me because you were ashamed. She glanced at Edith, who was watching the scene with cold, calculated disgust. You wanted to sit at this table, Coretta continued, her gold adinkra earrings catching the fiery glow of the table's candle. You wanted to pretend you were born from old money and country clubs. You let this woman treat your heritage like a dark spot on your resume. Well, Julian, if you are too big for my table, then you are far too small for your father's money. Coretta, enough, Edith barked, standing up to face her. You are acting out of pure, uneducated emotion. This man is a senior executive at a major financial institution. His reputation is worth millions. You are sabotaging his career over a bruised ego. Coretta smiled, an elegant, terrifying curve of her lips. Edith, you have spent your whole life managing beauty spas, so let me teach you something about the banking world. Reputation isn't built on cashmere. It's built on leverage. Coretta reached into her handbag and pulled out a single embossed cream envelope. She didn't hand it to Julian. She laid it precisely next to the birthday cake, right beside the glowing 45 candles. What is that? Julian asked, his voice trembling. That is a formal revocation of the co-signer guarantee for your line of credit at Palmetto Regional, Coretta said plainly. Julian froze. His entire body went rigid. "No, Mom, you didn't. You couldn't." "What does that mean?" Patricia demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Julian, what did she co-sign?" Julian couldn't look at his wife. His chest was heaving. At the Tier 1 executive level, an American banking character and debt-to-income ratios were monitored under a microscope. When Julian had purchased their massive 5-bedroom home in Mount Pleasant and leased the midnight black Mercedes-Benz to maintain his executive image, his personal debt-to-income ratio had spiked dangerously high. To secure the ultra-low prime interest rates required to keep their lifestyle afloat, he had needed a primary asset guarantor with a perfect decades-long credit profile and substantial collateral. Coretta had been that guarantor. She had used the unencumbered historical deed of her Meeting Street property and her flawless 35-year history at the central bank to back her son's vanity. In the United States, Julian Coretta said, her voice cutting through the ambient piano music like a scalpel. When a primary guarantor revokes their signature due to undisclosed financial instability of the borrower, the automated credit underwriting systems don't wait for a meeting. By midnight tonight, your personal credit score will take an automatic programmatic dive of over 180 points. Your variable rate bridge loans for the new construction will default instantly into high-risk status. "My God," Julian whispered, sinking back into his chair, his face completely hollow. "The Risk Management Committee. The automated alerts will hit the regional vice president's desk before the market opens at 9 a.m. "Exactly," Coretta said. "A branch manager who cannot maintain his own Tier 1 credit rating cannot legally oversee the commercial portfolios of the city's oldest families. You wanted to talk about legacy, Julian. Your legacy is currently recalculating." The table fell into a suffocating dead silence. Patricia stared at her husband as if he were a stranger, her mind racing through the immediate social and financial fallout of a defaulted mortgage in their exclusive neighborhood. Edith sat down slowly, her sharp eyes darting over Coretta, searching for a weakness. A crack in the armor, but finding only the solid, unyielding iron of a woman who had reclaimed her domain. Only Amanda moved. The 14-year-old girl walked around the table, bypassing her paralyzed parents, and threw her arms around Coretta's waist. She buried her face in the heavy royal blue silk of her grandmother's dress, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I'm sorry, Grandma." Amanda wept. "I'm so sorry." Coretta wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, holding her tight, resting her chin against the girl's soft hair. The coldness in Coretta's eyes softened into a deep maternal warmth. "You have nothing to be sorry for, my beautiful girl," Coretta whispered into her ear. "Your grandfather built an educational trust for you the day you pulled your first breath into this world. It is an irrevocable trust. It sits in a vault that neither your father's greed nor his mistakes can ever touch. You are going to go to medical school. You are going to be a grand doctor. Your foundation is made of stone." She kissed the top of Amanda's head, then gently released her, stepping back. She picked up her tablet from the table, tucked it back into her vintage leather bag, and adjusted the lapels of her matching royal blue jacket. She looked down at Julian one last time. He was staring at the floor, his hands gripped tightly between his knees, looking exactly like the 6-year-old boy who had broken her crystal vase 32 years ago. "The sweet potato pie is on the counter, Julian," Coretta said softly, her voice carrying a final haunting note of love that had survived the betrayal. "It will keep until tomorrow, but the locks on the Meeting Street apartment have already been changed. Do not come to my home to beg for your money. Come only when you remember how to be my son." With that, Coretta Miller turned her back on the VIP section. She walked down the raised platform, her head held incredibly high, her silver hair catching the chandeliers of the grand dining hall. Every step she took was steady, proud, and rhythmic. As she passed the maitre d', she paused, reached into her purse, and placed a crisp $50 bill into his hand. "Thank you for the hospitality, young man," she said with an elegant nod. The waterfront view was exactly what I needed tonight. She walked through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool, rain-slicked night air of Charleston, leaving the warmth of the restaurant behind her and stepping into the magnificent, unshakable freedom of her own voice. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving Charleston wrapped in a heavy, suffocating humidity that rose from the asphalt like steam from a kettle. Sunlight, sharp and blinding, cut through the slatted blinds of Coretta's Meeting Street apartment, casting long golden bars across the thousands of book spines lining her living room. Coretta sat in Leonard's worn brown leather armchair, a cup of black chicory coffee resting on the small side table next to her. She had been awake since 5 a.m. Age changes your sleep patterns, but purpose changes your focus. On the kitchen counter, the sweet potato pie remained untouched, its rich scent now faint, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of lemon oil and old paper. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the silence of the street below was shattered by the aggressive screech of high-performance tires. Coretta didn't stir. She didn't look out the window. She knew the rhythmic purr of that midnight black Mercedes engine better than any mechanic. Seconds later, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded up the wooden stairwell of the historic building. The brass doorknob rattled violently, followed by the sharp metallic thud of a key being shoved into the lock. It twisted halfway, jammed against the new deadbolt Coretta had paid Marcus's grandson $50 to install at midnight, and stopped. A heavy silence hung in the hallway. Then a desperate, breathless pounding rattled the old oak door. Mom, open the door." Julian's voice was ragged, stripped of every ounce of his polished boardroom dignity. "Mom, please. I know you're in there. We need to talk right now. The bank. The system flagged my profile at midnight. Open the door." Coretta took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She let the pounding continue for a full minute, allowing the weight of the heavy oak barrier to settle into her son's panicked mind. Then she stood up, smoothed the front of her house dress, and walked to the door. She unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open by 6 inches, keeping her frame solid in the gap. Julian looked disastrous. His hair, usually styled to perfection with expensive pomade, was damp from sweat and disheveled. His linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his silk tie stuffed carelessly into his coat pocket. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark shadows that spoke of a sleepless night spent staring at credit tickers and risk management alerts. "Good morning, Julian." Coretta said, her voice a low, cool hum that offered no shelter. "You're breathing heavily. Did you forget how to climb 3 flights of stairs?" "Mom, please stop the games," Julian pleaded, his hands extended palms up in a gesture of pure desperation. The automated underwriting system at Palmetto Regional issued a Tier 1 margin call on my personal lines at 12:01 a.m. My corporate expense card was declined at a gas station on the way home last night. The Regional Compliance VP has already scheduled an emergency review for my branch on Monday morning. You have to reverse the cosigner revocation. It's a glitch. Tell them it was a glitch." Coretta looked at him, her dark eyes completely unreadable. She unlatched the safety chain and stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come inside, Julian, but leave the executive panic in the hallway. This is a house of quiet study." Julian rushed into the living room like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. He didn't sit down. He began pacing the length of the Persian rug, his hands flying through the air as he spoke. "You don't understand the mechanisms, Mom. If my credit score drops below 620 due to a primary guarantor withdrawal, the bank's internal bylaws flag me as a high-risk employee. I won't just lose the Threnody for the regional vice presidency, they will suspend my lending authority. I'll be pushed out. Everything I've spent 15 years building in this city will be gone by Friday. Sit down, Julian." Coretta said, her voice dropping into that deep, authoritative register that had once kept hundreds of college students silent in the research library. Julian stopped pacing. The sheer ancestral weight of her tone hit him like a physical wall. He collapsed onto the old velvet sofa, his head dropping into his hands. "How could you do this to me?" he whispered into his palms. "On your birthday, you destroyed my life." "No, son," Coretta said, sitting across from him in Leonard's armchair. "I simply showed you the invoice for the life you've been living. You thought your lifestyle was built on your brilliance. You forgot that your brilliance was financed by our sacrifice." She reached down to the lower shelf of the coffee table and pulled out a heavy leather-bound binder. It wasn't an old photo album this time. It was a professional tabbed asset ledger stamped with the logo of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA. She dropped it onto the table in front of him with a heavy thud. "What is this?" Julian asked, squinting through his exhaustion. "Open it," she commanded. Julian opened the binder. His eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. It wasn't a collection of library cards or old receipts. It was a meticulously organized portfolio printout high-yield corporate bonds, specialized exchange-traded funds, ETFs, shorting the commercial real estate market, and algorithmic index hedges. At the top of the summary page, the total account equity was printed in bold, dark numbers. It was a sum that exceeded Julian's entire 5-year salary accumulation at the bank. "Where did you get this?" Julian stammered, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. This is a private institutional grade portfolio. Whose name is on this?" "Look at the top left corner, Manager Miller," Coretta said, leaning back, her silver hair catching the morning light like a halo of steel. Julian's eyes drifted to the corner of the document. Printed clearly in official registry font was Holder Coretta M. Miller, sole proprietor. How Julian breathed, looking up at his mother as if she had suddenly transformed into a stranger before his eyes. "You're a retired librarian. You receive a standard state pension and grandfather's old Social Security survivorship. You don't have the trading clearance for these kinds of institutional instruments." For 35 years, Julian Thur sat in the vault of the Central Bank's research library. Coretta said, her voice steady and resonant. "Every major merger, every historical bond issue, every municipal restructuring package in the state of South Carolina passed through my hands before it went to the printing presses. I didn't just file those documents, son. I read them." She stood up and walked to one of the massive bookshelves, pulling down a thick, worn text titled Advanced Market Analytics and Risk Arbitrage. "When you were busy buying $5,000 watches to impress Edith's country club friends," Coretta continued, placing the book on the table, "I was sitting right here, using the high-speed internet connection your daughter Amanda set up for me, studying for my Series 7 and Series 65 equivalencies online. I didn't need a fancy office in Mount Pleasant to understand how money moves, Julian. Money leaves a trail of ink, and I am a master tracker." Julian stared at the binder, then at his mother, a profound sense of cognitive dissonance paralyzing his mind. The woman he had spent the last decade treating like an old fragile relic, someone to be visited out of duty, someone too simple to understand his complex corporate world, was holding a financial portfolio that was leaner, smarter, and far more recession-proof than the portfolios he managed for the bank's top clients. "For 5 years," Coretta said, her eyes pinning him to the sofa, "I watched how you handled the money your father left behind. I gave you the authority because I wanted to see what kind of man you were when nobody was looking. And do you know what I saw, Julian?" Julian swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. "I saw a boy who used his father's lifetime of physical labor to buy his way into a culture that doesn't care about his soul," Coretta said, her voice cracking with a flash of raw maternal pain. "I saw you use $3,000 from the family commercial account to pay for a weekend golf retreat with Patricia's friends, while you told me you couldn't afford the time to help me fix the leaking radiator in this kitchen. I saw you take $10,000 from the life insurance liquidity to lease that black car, while your father's sister on Edisto Island was struggling to pay for her insulin. You thought I was blind because I stayed quiet. But a librarian never speaks until she has all the data. Mom, I was going to put it back, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The investments. The market was volatile. The market isn't volatile, Julian. Your character is, Coretta countered sharply. You took the generational wealth we built with black dirt splinters and library dust, and you turned it into costume jewelry for Patricia and Edith. You wanted to live like a king on a foundation made of cardboard. She walked back to her armchair and sat down, her composure returning like the calm after a thunderclap. So here are the new terms of your employment in this family, Coretta announced, tapping her fingers against the leather armrest. I have already executed the paperwork with Robert Hayes this morning. The Miller family estate has been legally restructured into an irrevocable family trust. Julian's head snapped up. Irrevocable, Mom, that means you can't dissolve it without court intervention. You've locked it down completely. Exactly, Coretta said. 60% of every single dollar your father and I ever made has been locked into a bulletproof educational and real estate trust for Amanda. You cannot touch it. Patricia cannot touch it. And Edith certainly cannot use it as collateral for her failing spa franchises. Julian gasped. How do you know about the spas? I told you, Julian. I look at data, Coretta said with a faint, cold smile. Edith's corporate tax liens are public record in Richland County. You were planning to use my primary liquidity accounts to bail out your mother-in-law's vanity business under the guise of buying a new house for Patricia. Did you think I wouldn't notice the commercial cross-collateralization clauses in your pending loan applications? Julian closed his eyes. The final layer of his deception had been stripped away, leaving him completely naked in front of the woman who had taught him how to read. The remaining 40%, Coretta continued, her voice clinical and unyielding, is divided. 30% remains under my sole administrative signature for my living expenses and my philanthropic work with the Low Country Literacy Foundations. The final 10%, I have placed into a restricted operational account under your name. Julian looked up, a small, desperate glimmer of hope appearing in his eyes. 10%, that's enough to cover the immediate margin call. It will save my credit score before Monday morning. It will save your credit score, Coretta agreed, but it comes with a ledger, Julian. Every single dollar you spend from that account will require a digital receipt upload and a written justification. You will come to this apartment on the first Sunday of every single month. You will sit at that table, you will eat whatever food I prepare for you, and you will present your personal accounting ledgers to me for a manual audit. Julian's jaw tightened. The humiliation was total. A senior branch manager, a man who gave financial advice to the wealthiest elites of Mount Pleasant, was being placed on a financial allowance by his 68-year-old mother. You are treating me like a child, Julian said, his voice thick with resentment. You acted like a child when you lied to me on my birthday, Julian, Coretta said, her voice rising in power. You acted like a child when you thought a fancy car and a big house made you a man. A man honors the womb that bore him. A man respects the sweat that cleared his path. If you want to regain your standing as a trustee of this family's legacy, you will earn it dollar by dollar, truth by truth, over the next 12 months. She stood up, walked to the front door, and pulled it wide open, letting the blinding Charleston sunlight stream into the hallway. Now take your ledger and get out of my sight, Coretta said, her posture majestic, her royal blue dress shining in the morning glow. Go back over the bridge to Mount Pleasant. Explain to your wife why the custom house isn't being built this summer. And on Monday morning, when you look at your SEP Mr. August Reynolds, you remember who taught him how to balance his very first ledger. Julian stood up slowly, picking up the heavy binder like a soldier retreating from a battlefield he had completely lost. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. He walked out of the apartment, his shoulders slumped, his executive mask shattered into dust. Coretta closed the door, turning the heavy deadbolt with a satisfying deep click. She walked back to the kitchen, picked up her cold coffee, and walked out onto the small balcony. Looking out over the rooftops toward the sparkling waters of the Cooper River, she took a deep, clean breath. The battle had begun, but for the first time in 5 years, the history of the Miller family was being written entirely in her own script. The corporate headquarters of the central bank did not belong to the pastel-washed, tourism-friendly aesthetic of historical Charleston. It sat on Broad Street, a monolithic fortress of Greek Revival limestone and smoked glass designed to signal one thing to the old money families of South Carolina: unyielding permanence. On Monday morning at 8:45 a.m., the glass atrium smelled of high-grade espresso floor wax and the quiet, distinct anxiety of 700 employees terrified of losing their spot in the upper middle class. Julian Miller walked through the security turnstiles, his swipe card chiming with a crisp electronic chirp. He looked immaculate: a bespoke char-gray charcoal suit, a crisp Egyptian cotton shirt, and a tie that cost more than Coretta's monthly utility bill. But beneath the tailoring, Julian was hollow. His eyes were bloodshot behind his designer frames. His phone was vibrating against his thigh every 4 minutes. Alert mortgage bridge, loan reevaluation in progress. Suspension of underwriting detected. He ignored the pings. His mind was focused entirely on one man, August Reynolds, the chief financial officer of the entire regional enterprise. Julian had spent 3 months angling for this 9 a.m. meeting. Nominally, it was a routine performance review for his Mount Pleasant branch, but in reality, it was Julian's pitch for the upcoming regional vice presidency. If he could impress August with his branch's Q2 digitization metrics, the compliance red flags triggered by his mother's credit revocation might be buried under a mountain of profit margins. He took the private executive elevator to the 10th floor, the executive suite where the carpets were so thick you couldn't hear a man coming until he was already standing behind you. Manager Miller, August's executive assistant, a poised woman with silver hair and a sharp tailored suit, said without looking up from her terminal, "Mr. Reynolds is expecting you in conference room A. He has brought in a senior advisory consultant for this review. Please go straight in." Julian's throat went dry. A consultant. That wasn't standard for a Q2 branch review. He adjusted his cuffs, took a deep breath to settle the tremor in his hands, and pushed open the heavy mahogany door of conference room A. The room was vast, dominated by a 20-foot slate table and glass walls overlooking the sparkling waters of the Cooper River Bridge. At the head of the table sat August Reynolds, 62 years old, tall with sharp patrician features, and a tailored linen suit that spoke of old South Carolina ancestry. But it wasn't August who drew the air out of Julian's lungs. Sitting in the high-backed leather executive chair immediately to August's right was a 68-year-old black woman. She wore a sharply structured ivory tweed suit with a silk navy blouse. Her silver hair was styled into a flawless, razor-sharp bob. Hanging from her ears were the massive solid gold Adinkra hoops that Julian had seen in the dim light of the waterfront grill just 4 days prior. On the table in front of her sat a vintage fountain pen, a pristine glass of mineral water, and a stack of leather-bound historical ledger folders that Julian recognized instantly from his childhood home. Coretta Miller didn't look up when the door opened. She was calmly reviewing a spreadsheet on an institutional-grade tablet. "Julian," August said, standing up and offering a brief, firm handshake. "Come in, sit. You're precisely on time. Excellent." Julian managed to move his legs, though his knees felt like wet cardboard. He sat across from them, his briefcase clicking open with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. "Mr. Reynolds," Julian stammered, his eyes darting frantically to his mother, who still hadn't acknowledged his presence. I didn't realize we were having an external audit today. I brought the Mount Pleasant metrics, but—" "This isn't a routine audit, Julian," August interrupted, leaning back in his chair, his face a calm corporate mask. "As you know, the bank is currently undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar migration project, digitizing our historical trust ledgers from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If we misinterpret the old asset clauses or the ancestral land deeds, the legal exposure to the bank could be catastrophic. August paused, gesturing with a polite, deferential hand toward the woman beside him. Therefore, the board authorized me to bring in the absolute highest authority on our historical asset structures. Julian, I believe you know Mrs. Coretta Miller. Though judging by the compliance alerts that hit my desk at midnight, you seem to have forgotten exactly who she is. The silence in the room became absolute. The only sound was the distant muffled hum of the city below. Coretta finally raised her head, her dark eyes clear and cold as deep-sea water locked onto her son. There was no anger in her face. There was only the immense, terrifying weight of a master librarian who had just found a major error in a catalog. "Good morning, Manager Miller." Coretta said, her voice a smooth, resonant baritone that filled the executive suite with effortless authority. "Let's bypass the pleasantries. We have a substantial amount of data to audit, and my time is billed at an institutional premium." Julian's hands were sweating beneath the table. "Mom, what is this? What are you doing here?" August, Coretta said, turning slightly to the CFO, completely ignoring Julian's stuttering. "Let's look at the Mount Pleasant ledger allocations first. Your young manager here has been projecting a 12% growth margin based on the commercial acquisition packages in the Cooper River District. But he has made a fundamental amateur error in his risk assessment models." She tapped her tablet, sending a document directly to the massive projection screen on the wall behind Julian. Julian turned around and felt his stomach drop. On the screen was the master loan ledger for a series of commercial properties in the city, properties owned by a shell corporation named Edith's Oasis Enterprises, LLC. "Mrs. Miller has spent the last 72 hours reviewing the foundational land titles." August explained, his tone dropping into a freezing clinical register. She discovered that the primary collateral Julian accepted for these loans, the high-end day spa properties in Richland County, are actually subject to a historical municipal reversion clause dating back to 1954. The state has the right to reclaim that land for highway expansion at any moment. The collateral is effectively worth zero. Julian Coretta said, her fountain pen clicking against the slate table with a rhythmic, damning tick. "You accepted this collateral without a deep archive title search. Why, a first-year intern knows that old Richland County titles require a manual reference check in the basement vault. Did you fail to perform the check because you were incompetent? Or did you skip the protocol because the owner of Edith's Oasis is the woman whose country club fees you've been trying to pay with my money?" Julian's face went from pale to a mottled, furious purple. He slammed his palms against the slate table, standing up. "This is a conflict of interest. Mr. Reynolds, this woman is my mother. She is using personal family grievances to sabotage my standing in this company. She withdrew her co-signer guarantee on my personal lines last week, out of pure emotional malice." "Sit down, Julian," August said. He didn't shout, but the sheer icy steel in the CFO's voice made Julian freeze mid-breath. August leaned forward, his eyes boring into Julian's forehead. "Let me clear up a historical misconception for you, young man. 25 years ago, I was a 22-year-old trainee in the basement of the old Central Branch. I was clumsy, I was arrogant, and I almost destroyed a multi-million-dollar municipal bond package because I didn't know how to read an old cursive registry ledger. Do you know who spent 3 nights in that dark vault with me teaching me how to analyze historical risk? Do you know who taught me that integrity isn't found in a spreadsheet, but in the truth of the documentation?" August pointed a long, aristocratic finger at Coretta. "Your mother trained me, Julian. She trained the current CEO of this bank. She trained half the state judiciary. She is not an external family grievance. She is the institutional memory of this entire banking system. And when she tells me that a branch manager has exposed this firm to a high-risk collateral fraud to satisfy his mother-in-law's debts, I don't see an emotional mother. I see a profound corporate liability." Julian sank back into his chair, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The luxury world he had built the Mount Pleasant house, the country club smiles. The illusion of independent brilliance was being pulled apart piece by piece, not by a corporate rival, but by the very woman whose silver hair he had ignored on her 70th birthday. "Mom!" Julian whispered, his voice cracking, looking at her with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "Please, if you do this, my promotion is gone. The board will initiate a formal character review. I'll be ruined." Coretta looked at him, and for a brief second a shadow of maternal sorrow crossed her elegant features. She looked at the vintage fountain pen in her hand, the one Leonard had given her when she became head librarian. "You were already ruined, Julian," Coretta said softly, her voice carrying the deep, mournful weight of a low-country spiritual. "You were ruined the moment you started measuring your worth by the length of your car and the color of your neighbor's skin. You thought that by moving across the bridge you could leave the dirt and the struggle behind. You forgot that the only reason your feet are on the 10th floor of this building today is because your father's back was bent over a sawhorse for 40 years. She closed her tablet with a soft, decisive snap. "August," Coretta said, turning to the CFO. "The Mount Pleasant branch does not need to be liquidated. The metrics are solid, but the leadership is structurally compromised. Julian lacks the historical perspective to manage high net worth trust allocations. He looks at the numbers, but he cannot see the people behind them." August nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I agree. Julian, effective at 9 a.m. tomorrow, your authority as branch manager of the Mount Pleasant flagship is suspended pending a full compliance review of the Edith's Oasis loan packages. You are being reassigned." Julian's heart stopped. "Reassigned where?" "To the archival digitization unit in the basement vault," August said coldly. "You will report to the junior clerk team. You will spend the next 12 months scanning, cataloging, and manually indexing the historical registries from 1890 to 1960. Your salary will be adjusted to the base clerk level. Your executive expense accounts are revoked." "The basement!" Julian breathed, horror flashing across his face. That's where the trainees go. Everyone will see me. The whole city will know I've been demoted." "Then you will have plenty of time to remember who you are while you're down there." Coretta said, her voice rising with a magnificent, unyielding majesty. "You will sit among the old papers, Julian. You will read the names of the men and women who actually built this city with their hands. And every morning when you walk past the reference desk, you will look at the portrait of the woman who held this bank together before you were even a thought in your father's mind." Coretta stood up. She gathered her leather folders, tucked her tablet into her ivory briefcase, and smoothed the jacket of her tweed suit. She looked down at her son one final time. He was sitting with his chin pressed against his chest, his hands gripping the edges of the slate table, as if he were trying to prevent the world from spinning out of his control. "Mr. Reynolds will expect you in the basement at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow, Julian," Coretta said, her tone clinical, yet carrying a faint, distant ember of hope. "Don't wear the bespoke suit. It gets very dusty down there." She turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. August Reynolds stood up, bowing his head slightly in deep respect as she passed. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Your invoice will be settled by noon." Thank you, August," Coretta said, her voice echoing softly in the grand room. "Keep the coffee hot for the boys in the basement. They have a long winter ahead of them." She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the executive hallway, her low heels clicking against the marble tile with the absolute triumphant rhythm of a woman who had not just defended her honor, she had re-indexed the entire system. The basement vault of the central bank did not have windows. It smelled of compressed air, industrial floor cleaner, and the heavy decomposing sugar of 90-year-old wood pulp paper. Down here, the thunderous hum of the building's main HVAC cooling towers felt like a perpetual low-frequency tremor through the soles of Julian's work boots. It was late October. 4 months had passed since the emergency compliance audit on Broad Street. Julian Miller stood in front of a heavy industrial scanning bed, his hands encased in blue nitrile gloves. He was no longer wearing the charcoal bespoke suits or the custom-tailored linen shirts. Today, he wore a simple dark blue polo and utility trousers, the mandatory uniform of the archival digitization team. His fingers, which had spent years signing multi-million-dollar credit drafts with a fountain pen, were now stained at the tips with the gray carbon dust of the 1934 foreclosure registries. "Miller!" a voice called out from the darkness of the aisle. It was Clara, a 24-year-old junior clerk who had once been terrified of Julian when he was a branch manager across the river. Now she was his shift supervisor. The regional risk team just sent down 3 more crates of the Gullah Geechee land grants from the Reconstruction era. They need a manual cross-index by 5 p.m. Don't skip the signature verification. "I'm on it, Clara." Julian said, his voice flat, steady, and entirely devoid of his old executive arrogance. He walked to the iron crate, lifted the heavy plastic lid, and carefully pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder with crumbling edges. As he laid it on the glass matrix of the scanner, his eyes caught the faded, elegant cursive of a handwritten property log from 1895. At the bottom of the page, written in the margins as a reference note to the head of the Treasury, were the sharp, immaculate initials, CMM. Julian's breath hitched. He touched the glass over the ancient ink. For 4 months, every single document he handled, every historical land trust he cataloged, bore the ghost of his mother's precision. Coretta hadn't just worked in this library. She had mapped the very DNA of the bank's wealth. He had spent a decade thinking he was a giant because he stood on the top floor of the skyscraper. But down here in the dark, he finally realized that his mother was the bedrock upon which the entire tower had been anchored. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It didn't flash with commercial paper alerts or VIP country club notifications anymore. His credit score had plateaued at a sterile 610, freezing him out of the luxury finance loops of Mount Pleasant. The screen read, "Amanda. I'm stepping off the school bus now, Dad. I'm heading to Grandma's apartment to study for the AP biology exam. Are you coming tonight?" Julian stared at the screen, a heavy familiar ache tightening in his chest. He hadn't spoken to his mother since the morning after the dinner disaster. He had sent messages, he had left voice notes, but Coretta had maintained her boundaries with the absolute unyielding silence of a vault door. He typed back, "Tell her I'll be outside on the steps at 7 p.m. The drive across the Cooper River Bridge back to Mount Pleasant at 5 p.m. no longer felt like a victory lap. The midnight black Mercedes-Benz was gone reclaimed by the leasing company 2 days after Coretta revoked her guarantor signature. Julian now drove a dented beige 10-year-old sedan he had purchased with cash from his restricted 10% operational allowance. When he pulled into the driveway of his custom-built home, the house looked different. The manicured lawn was slightly overgrown. The luxury landscaping service had been canceled in August. Inside, the grand kitchen was completely dark. Patricia sat at the marble island, a glass of Pinot Grigio in her hand, surrounded by a mountain of real estate cancellation forms and legal correspondence from the Mount Pleasant Architectural Board. The custom house lot in Bell Hall had been legally forfeited 3 weeks ago. They had lost the $50,000 earnest deposit because Julian's financing structure had collapsed in the wake of his credit dive. "Julian," Patricia said, her voice dry without looking up as he walked in. "My mother called. She's selling the West Ashley spa location. The bank finalized the foreclosure on the collateral this morning. She blames you. She says your mother's audit was a targeted vendetta." Julian set his lunchbox down on the counter. He looked at his wife, at the lines of bitter resentment etched around her eyes, at the expensive jewelry that now felt like iron weights around her neck. "It wasn't a vendetta, Patricia," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying the calm, heavy gravity he had learned in the basement vault. "Edith's business was a fraud built on bad land titles and inflated assets. My mother didn't destroy Edith's business. She just turned the lights on so the bank could see the empty room." Patricia slammed her wine glass down on the marble. How can you defend her? Look at us. We are the laughingstock of the country club. People are asking why you're working in the basement with the interns. We had to pull Amanda out of the private tennis academy. Amanda didn't want the tennis academy, Patricia, Julian said, his voice remaining perfectly level. She wanted her father to look her in the eye without lying. For 15 years, we've been eating dinners we couldn't afford with people who didn't care about our names. I'm done running on cardboard. He walked out of the kitchen, ignoring his wife's bitter scoff, and grabbed his coat from the hall closet. As he reached for the doorknob, he looked into the mirror on the wall. For the first time in his life, he didn't check the knot of his silk tie or the brand of his watch. He looked at his eyes. They were tired, lined with carbon dust, but they looked exactly like Leonard's eyes used to look after a long day in the carpentry workshop. At 6:45 p.m., the rain began to fall over Meeting Street, a gentle, cool autumn rain that washed the dust from the slate steps of Coretta's building. Julian parked his old sedan at the corner and walked up the sidewalk. He didn't rush. He let the rain damp his hair, cooling the frantic energy that had governed his life for a decade. He carried nothing but his old leather briefcase, which now held a single neatly printed ledger of his personal expenses for the past 4 months, and a small brown paper bag from the Central Market. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his boots echoing in the historic stairwell. When he reached the 3rd floor, he didn't pound on the door. He didn't slide a key into the lock. He stood in the hallway, took a deep breath, and knocked twice softly, with the rhythm of a child coming home after a long, difficult day at school. The heavy deadbolt turned with a deep, familiar click. The door swung open. Amanda stood there, a biology textbook cradled in her arms, her eyes shining with a bright, sudden warmth. "Dad, you're here. Come inside, it's cold out there." Julian stepped into the apartment. The living room was exactly as it had been for 40 years. The smell of chicory coffee, old paper, and lemon polish wrapped around him like an old blanket. And there, sitting at the dining table under the soft amber light of the chandelier, was Coretta. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue cardigan, her silver hair brushed back into its neat chignon. In front of her sat 2 white porcelain plates, 2 silver forks, and an open ledger book. Between the plates sat the sweet potato pie, freshly baked golden brown, radiating a warmth that filled the entire room with the scent of nutmeg and brown sugar. "Hello, Julian," Coretta said, her voice a low, melodious cadence that carried no anger, only the vast, deep patience of a low-country mother. "You're 5 minutes early. Punctuality is a good quality in a clerk." Julian walked to the table. He didn't sit down immediately. He reached into his brown paper bag and pulled out a small, beautifully carved wooden block, a piece of old, reclaimed South Carolina heart pine that he had found in the bank's old architectural salvage vault during his digitization work. He had spent 3 evenings in his garage using his father's old sandpaper, polishing the wood until the deep crimson grain shone like fire. He laid the block gently next to the sweet potato pie. "I found this in the deep archives, Mom," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. "It's from the original floorboards of the 1890 reference room. The wood is still strong. It just needed the dust cleared off." Coretta looked at this polished block of pine. She reached out her long, silver-ringed fingers, tracing the smooth grain of the wood. A soft, beautiful smile finally broke across her face. A smile that carried the memory of Leonard, the memory of Folly Beach, and the memory of the little boy who used to draw pictures on her library scrap paper. "Sit down, son," Coretta said softly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "The pie is hot." Julian sat down. He opened his leather briefcase, pulled out his personal financial ledger for the past 4 months, and pushed it across the table toward her. "Every receipt is logged, Mom," Julian said, looking her straight in the eye, his face completely open, completely honest. "The grocery bills, Amanda's textbooks, the utility drafts. There are no cross-collateralizations. There are no shell corporations. My personal debt-to-income ratio is under 20%. I am living within the 10% allowance." Coretta didn't open the ledger. She simply laid her hand over the leather cover, keeping her eyes fixed on his. "I don't need to read the numbers tonight, Julian," Coretta said, her voice carrying a deep, resonant peace that vibrated through the small room. "I've been watching you walk into that basement vault every morning for 4 months. I've seen how you carry the crates. I've seen how you handle the old names. You're learning how to read the foundation again. I am Mom." Julian whispered, a single hot tear tracking down through the carbon dust on his cheek. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the lie. I'm sorry for making you feel invisible." "A librarian is never invisible, Julian," Coretta said, her smile elegant and majestic as she lifted the silver knife and cut a deep, generous slice of the sweet potato pie, placing it onto his plate. "We are simply waiting for the world to finish its noisy chatter so we can give them the correct reference." She cut a slice for herself, then looked up at Amanda, who was watching them from the sofa with a beautiful, quiet pride in her eyes. "Amanda, baby, put the biology book down. Come sit at your grandfather's table. The family ledger is perfectly balanced tonight." Outside, the Charleston rain continued to fall over the Ashley River, washing away the salt and the pluff mud of the old city, clearing the streets for a new season. But inside the third-floor apartment on Meeting Street, under the amber glow of the books and the silver hair of the matriarch, the Miller family was finally sitting at the only table that ever truly mattered, a table built on truth, financed by respect, and preserved by the unyielding dignity of a woman who had finally found her voice.